and welcome to today's webinar from Squire Patton Boggs on managing the cost of living crisis and recession-proofing your business. This is the first in a series of webinars we're doing in our Advertising, Media and Brands Global Compliance Challenge series for this winter 2022 to 2023. This year has obviously provided some unique challenges for businesses operating across the advertising, media and brands industry. Aside from the impact of the pandemic and the continuing fallout from that, we're seeing a changing and challenging landscape due to increasing economic, consumer, regulatory and compliance pressures, and we expect that to continue well into the year ahead. With increased exposure as a result of these pressures, we'll be hosting these 4 webinars to support the advertising, media, brands industry in navigating these challenges. My name's Matthew Kirk. I'm International Affairs Advisor in our Public Policy International practice. My job is to provide strategic advice concerning business, politics and international law and advise clients on regulatory risk, market entry, cyber risk, reputational risk, that kind of thing. Today, in this first webinar of the series, we'll be focusing on managing the cost of living and recession-proofing your business. Future webinars will look at global data, technology and tax, at global anti-counterfeiting and brand protection trends and advertising, media and brands hot topics, and at the future of ESG and global workforce challenges. Without further ado, let me say a quick word of introduction to my colleagues who are joining us for this webinar this afternoon. With me here in the UK, Charlotte Moller, and over across the Atlantic in the US, Carol Denniston, who are both partners in our restructuring and insolvency team, and they'll be discussing recession-proofing your business. And then also with me in the UK, we'll have an update from my colleague Hannah Kendrick on prioritizing your ESG strategy. But to kick us off, I'm just going to share a few thoughts about the state of the global economy and the context, therefore, in which we're looking forward to the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023. And I think the first point to make is that we're in obviously an extraordinary economic context. It's one in which, if you look at the curve of global inflation, we go from 4.7% last year to 8.8% this year, 6.5%, and then 4.1% in 2024. So a sort of curve that does that. And if you look at global growth, you go from 6% last year down to 3% this year, 2 and a bit, 2.5-ish next year, and then a slight recovery going into 24. So a curve that does that. And that really illustrates the quite acute pressure that every economy is going to be under. If you look at the major developed economies for 2022, you've got, so the year finishing, you've got economies like the US, Germany and Japan running at about 1.5% growth, France, Italy, the UK, Canada a bit better, 2.5 to 3.5%. But then when you look into next year, you see that Germany and Italy move into probably a slight decline, the UK barely growing at all, the US, France, Italy and Canada either side of 1%. So the developed world really suffering quite a severe squeeze on growth at the same time as having inflation rates which are above those global trends, more like 10% or so at the moment. And if you look across at China, the sort of engine of the global economy, one of the effects of the impact of the pandemic, and particularly China's continued pursuit of a zero COVID strategy, is that Chinese growth has slowed into the sort of 3 to 4% range. And that is a very low number for an economy that has been used to growing at the scale at which China has been. a general halving of growth across emerging markets in the coming year, and as I've said, a very considerable contraction in the developed economies as well. And then we've got a whole load of sort of macro risk areas which are going to drive uncertainty into that economic picture. The numbers I've given, which come largely from the IMF, are just projections. Who knows what we will actually have? But there are a lot of pressures and tensions playing on the markets. We've just had the midterm elections in the US. That's going to lead to a shift in the ability of the administration to pursue the economic policies that it wants to pursue. We don't yet know exactly how great a shift it'll be, perhaps less than was anticipated by some. But the possibility certainly of the House and the Senate ending up in different hands politically, and that complicating the ability to pursue a clear political agenda. In Europe, I think the management of the euro is going to go through one of its periods of quite extreme tension. I'd say for central banks, generally, there's a very difficult balance between fighting inflation, which central banks typically do by putting up interest rates, and avoiding recession, which central banks typically do by lowering interest rates, at the same time as trying to unwind the huge amounts of quantitative easing that have happened to help the global economy, partly through the economic crisis following 2008, 2012, and partly through the pandemic. So it's a very, very difficult balancing act for central banks. Hard enough for the Fed in the US and the Bank of England in the UK, substantially harder in many ways for the European Central Bank, because it is at the same time trying to balance economies which have very different debt profiles, very different growth rates, inflation rates, and so forth, and achieving the right balance between what will serve Germany well, what will serve France well, what will serve Italy well, an extremely tough job to do. The overhang of COVID has left huge public debt, and that public debt is itself driving actions by government which are having a substantial effect on the economy, largely a recessionary effect as government tries to retrench after the huge spending of COVID. And then you have some of the impact of the conflict in Ukraine, a much less certain energy market, food prices increasing, and so forth. All of that driving a rate of inflation that we haven't seen in most of the developed world for 20 years and more. But this looks like being a recessionary period, rather unlike some of the ones we've had before. In particular, unemployment is not projected to rise by anything like as much as you would expect during a recession. And we have the inflation and recession combined, which is a particularly uncomfortable place in which to find ourselves. And I don't think that's going to get any easier through 2023. Most economic forecasts you look at see 2024 as the year in which things start to recover and pull together again, and we start to get back to a decent level of growth. The other general comment I'd make before just offering a couple of very quick thoughts on the advertising, media, and brand space is that the world that most of us have been used to operating in for the last 30 years, a world in which you could broadly invest where you wanted to invest, buy where you wanted to buy in terms of your supply chain, seek customers where you wanted to seek customers, without worrying too much about geography and geopolitical risk. That world has gone. It ended on the 24th of February. It had been ending for some time before, but it ended pretty definitively on the 24th of February. And geopolitical risk is now a factor in boardroom decision-taking in a way that it really hasn't had to be for most of the last 3 decades. And that will drive differences in the way in which companies think about their markets, think about how they project themselves. Some of the considerations that Hannah will be talking about later undoubtedly also feed into the reputational side of where and how you do business. And that coincides with a move which is partly linked to climate change and partly linked to pressure from society for companies to be enormously more transparent than they have been. A huge increase in disclosure requirements coming in most of the major developed markets. So the whole question of how reputation links together, how it projects itself and how it sustains a business, which obviously is the heart of the business that those of you on this webinar do, that is happening in a very different context. And just to add to that, we've seen in the past few months enormous declines in the overall value of the major online tech platforms, reflecting partly a substantial decline in their advertising revenues. There are other factors happening there as well. And in addition to regulation around transparency, we're seeing increased regulation in Europe and the UK, less so far in the US, though it may come there too, in terms of the content of material that appears online. Now, while that mainly targets activities that the advertising and media community are not pursuing, it is of huge interest to your community because your customers are very concerned about how their brands are represented and alongside what they're represented. And so this whole pattern of controlling more tightly what content goes where is one that any owner of a major global brand undoubtedly has. So that's my, I'm afraid, rather depressing scene setting, and I'm now going to turn to Charlotte and Carol and ask you please to talk about the sorts of challenges that you see businesses facing at the moment.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I mean, I think, to be fair, you've summarised the environment that businesses are finding themselves in very well there. So it's a complex set of economic headwinds, frankly, with the inflation and the higher interest rates, and its impact on consumers' sense of how much money they actually have in their pockets, and the knock-on effect, which tends to be a bit slower onto business. We're seeing a lot of businesses which are very uncomfortable in the environment where their energy costs are very hard to predict, and obviously that comes into the sort of data space as well in quite a major way. And the sort of economic costs of the COVID lockdowns are kind of coming home to roost as well. And you can see that in the UK, and I'm sure Carol can add for the US as well in a similar way, around sort of labour shortages, something like a return to austerity, I think we're seeing in the UK certainly. And then, as you mentioned, all the supply chain problems that were created. Well, Carol, I don't know whether you've got anything to add to that. So always the first issue with any webinar is with the mute button. But I know from speaking to Carol previously that we also just talked about the fact that it's a very different recession we're likely to see here from what we had with the global financial crisis, when you had the sort of sudden liquidity squeeze, which caught many businesses out. Here, you've got a different situation because it's a far more consumer and supply chain led issue that's arising. I don't know whether we've got Carol at this point now.
My mute button stuck. I mean, go figure. I've had a great day with technology, and I do apologize. I think the thing that we're seeing in the US, and this is recent within the last 2 weeks, is a very preemptive and proactive response from business, particularly on the West Coast in Silicon Valley. We have had reductions in force in law firms and in most of the tech companies. I know that you guys have probably been following the saga with Twitter and Elon Musk, but this morning, Meta slash Facebook's parent announced a significant cut in force on salespeople. So what we're seeing is what I would call the odd mix of proactive and reactive in our larger corporations, and particularly in our tech sectors, in anticipation of what the next few quarters are going to be. On the consumer level, Charlotte is very much right. We have tremendous stress across the US with consumers having to make choices. There was an article in the financial press this morning about those choices being whether to eat, go to the doctor, or buy energy. So people are now looking at those things that constitute true needs as opposed to having any income left for discretionary things. So I think that we're looking at a situation where we already have a recession that is well in place, and businesses are trying to respond to it. It's also complicated by the fact that there are still supply chain issues that are impacting the delivery of goods to the various distributors, whether it's Amazon or our grocery stores. We're still missing what I would say is consistency in delivery, and that includes everything from your milk and essentials to all the other items you buy in a grocery store. So we still have supply chain interruptions that are, it's not throughout the US, but it's in specific parts where we have spots where the consumer supply chain remains disrupted. The supply chain for some of our bigger corporates, it's been interesting to watch how they've addressed that moving into what I think is going to be a more challenging recession, is that many of them have decided to create their own supply chains to avoid the problems with the existing supply chains. So we have Amazon, Walmart, Costco, a whole list of others that basically have created their own supply chain, given that the cost to move goods on the ocean has dropped significantly from what it was during COVID. So I would say that in short, in the US, what's happening is this proactive reactive approach to what we're seeing in the economy, but also taking steps much sooner. And I think that's coupled by the fact that we haven't experienced this kind of inflation since the 70s and the 80s. There's causing, I think, people to take steps sooner rather than later. And I would say, just in closing, that I expect the volatility to continue. It's interesting, we're still waiting the outcome of the election, and that's going to impact a lot of things. There is some expectation, though, that our politicians will work across the aisle, particularly in connection with implementing the Infrastructure and the Inflation Reduction Act, both of which were passed before this midterm election. But we've got that added as another volatility, which, if you're following our market, you can guess what that looks like on a daily basis. It's up or down depending on what the Fed has said or what somebody else has fed into it. So it's US, it's pretty uncertain, highly volatile. And I think all of the businesses are working to reduce expenses and overhead, cutting cost in order to preserve liquidity.
And so, just looking at that picture you've outlined, what would you recommend business leaders do now to get their businesses ready to weather this coming storm of recession?
So I think when Carol and I talked about this ahead of the call or ahead of the webinar, it won't surprise you that we didn't have a sort of silver bullet for that particular conundrum. To some extent, we did think that it came down to three headings, however, one of which was supply chain management, which Carol has talked a little bit about already. And the other two key factors really are fundamental to running a business more generally, I suppose, are the cash management side and the corporate governance side. And on the cash management side, a lot of it is for the sort of the old saying, cash is king, and it does sound obvious. But certainly our conclusion was that the boards really need to monitor their rolling cash flow very closely, both in terms of the kind of monthly sources and the uses of cash, but also in terms of setting out quarterly cash flows and checking what the discrepancies are for the early warning signs that there might be problems ahead. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that as well, Carol.
Yeah, I would just say two things very quickly. The cost of goods sold is an issue that we've been talking with a lot of our boards about and keeping an eye on that, because there are oftentimes buried in those cost of goods sold the evidence of what inflation is going to do ultimately to the profits. That cash flow situation is something I'm always struck when I work with a company, that they focus on all the other accounting reports and not so much on cash flow. And this cycle is going to be all about cash flow. And I think that we're seeing steps now where people are taking as much care as they can to protect cash flow. But I think embedded in that taking care is also being more proactive with what's happening with your cost of goods sold.
Yeah, and I think feeding into that, actually, that there's an element of you can proactively do your homework as well for what that rainy day fund looks like, and where you might be able to actually create more liquidity in your business if times do get a bit tight. So it's, for example, understand what the other financing options might be for your business, who the reputable players in the market are to provide that type of financing for example, invoice discounting or stock discounting. And just knowing how they work so that you're not scrambling around at the last minute and not necessarily going with the sort of most reputable players in the market. So we have seen clients struggle with that in the past, where they've ended up taking financing solutions which aren't necessarily that suitable for their business. And I think just kind of coming back to the cash is king theme, we have seen a lot of clients drawing down proactively on facilities even ahead of when they need cash, to kind of get ahead, make sure they've got a bit of a buffer going. And I think just generally you find that if you can see a problem ahead, if you approach your bankers early and proactively with a plan, and a kind of full understanding to the extent one can have in this kind of uncertain environment, but with a plan for what the problem is and how you think you're going to be able to work through it, you're far more likely to get a good result in your discussions with the bank, because it gives them much more confidence in the management team that's in place going forward as well. So kind of an early recognition that there is a problem and an early recognition that you need to deal with it in a proactive way is so important.
I think that in the US, there's a cat and mouse game going on here right now, and that is that the rating agencies on rated debt are being very aggressive about coming in to do updates. That's creating a rush to draw on any facilities that are out there, because the expectation is the rating's not going to hold. And that's also counterbalanced with these reductions in force that we're seeing across larger companies right now, predominantly tech companies, but I don't think that's going to be the end of the story. So people are, I think, concerned, and also they're concerned, but they're troubled because we don't have any clarity as to what the next few quarters are going to look like, because the Fed seems to not be responding to any of the markers one would expect the Fed to respond to. And right now we're all expecting the same increase in interest the next time the Fed meets, which is not necessarily the best or the right answer, but it is creating a massive amount of uncertainty, which is adding to the volatility, which is why I think we're going to see a credit freeze in the US of some sort, because the interest rates are going to be more than particularly most of our stressed or distressed entities are going to be able to pay, which is why I think we've got this run on whatever credit they can access right now. And we also have the rating agencies becoming very focused on what's happening. So it's a story that's far from over, and it's the challenge I think for the people that work in the space that Charlotte and I work in is that we can't see, at least in the U.S., we can't see over the horizon. And I know that's a pretty dark thing to say, but it just looks like volatility, 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 particularly when we add our political environment in the US on top of our interest rates, it's hard to get comfortable. So I think we're in for a challenging, probably a challenging next year.
But yes, I totally agree with that, Carol. And I suppose in volatile times, I tend to suggest to boards actually that they focus on the stuff that they can control, which is often actually just making sure that they are, understanding what the kind of signs of distress, for example, might be in their counterparties, and keeping close to collections, for example, understanding that, where customers don't pay promptly, you need to be on top of that really quickly. You need to understand why they're not paying promptly, and actually sometimes it's putting pressure on those customers, which can be unpleasant at the time, and it can feel difficult, but actually you're probably going to get a better outcome if you get paid sooner rather than later. Keep an eye out for changes in senior management amongst your contractual counterparties as well, or the fact they're filing accounts late or changing accounting dates. Focus on the small stuff that you can control in order to help your business through. Because again, back to an old adage, if you count the pennies, hopefully the pounds will look after themselves. And in the same way, if you look at the smaller stuff that you can control within your business, it will help you in the longer run as well.
I think just by way of closing, I would throw one last thought. I think Charlotte is completely right on keeping your eye on all of the pennies and all of the tasks she just outlined. But in our larger clients, mid-sized and larger clients, there's also a need for the ability to look at this cycle from an overview. And we have encouraged a number of boards to create special committees so that what changes that they're making to address the volatility, all the things Charlotte just listed, but including reductions in force and things like that, that they're not damaging the ability to recover as the cycle as we move through the cycle. So I think the boards, particularly the ones that are larger corporates, need to be a little more sophisticated because there are unintended consequences for every action that we're talking about doing in connection with responding to the economy. So having a special committee that can evaluate it on a sort of overview in terms of what does this mean for the company, particularly if it's a key supplier and there needs to be concessions made. This is a very complex problem right now because we don't know when it's going to end. And I think the most useful thing that I can urge my corporate clients to do is create a committee that can look at the intended and the unintended consequences of the steps you're taking to maintain and protect not only liquidity, but your customer relationships and the relationships with your employees, because replacing a lot of the employees that you might be tempted to let go could be an extremely expensive proposition when we exit the cycle. So I think that the need for intentionality and strategy at the board level is extremely important in this cycle.
Well, thank you very much, Carol and Charlotte. I want now to turn to Hannah, because I think, Hannah, we've had a fairly gloomy outlook from me, and then a fantastic description from Carol and Charlotte of the kinds of considerations that boards are going to be looking at. Isn't there a risk that the hugely important issues that come under the traditional heading of ESG, environment, social and governance, that agenda is going to find itself squashed down at the bottom of the boardroom agenda, and not given as much attention as perhaps it might be in this very challenging time?
Thanks, Matthew. I mean, I think, I suppose you would expect me to say this, but I think it's probably now more important than ever that this ESG strategy remains, at the front and centre of the boardroom agenda. And I think particularly for those businesses where they're in that chain and consumer facing in some way, shape or form. You highlighted right at the start, Matthew, that brand and what that means is often going to be at the centre of any consumer buying decision, and so much of ESG is about that, that reputation and that brand. I mean, we heard from Carol and Charlotte about consumer confidence spending, everybody feeling the pinch, seeing what discretionary spend is going to be left. And I suppose it isn't a surprise that that's the first thing that we're sort of going to see coming through in terms of consumer spending. But I think boards have got to be wary of keeping an eye on that longer term view as well. And I think that's why we have to say stick to the ESG agenda. The idea that in dealing with this financial crisis that we've got on our plate, some businesses will lose that correlation between ESG performance and business performance is sort of, quite worrying, because ultimately that is one of the keys to longer term success, even if I think in the boardroom maintaining that strategy can feel like a very short term challenge. And we can see the energy prices kicking in here in my office because I haven't moved. I mean, businesses, as you said, Matthew, are dealing with sort of consumer, regulatory, compliance pressures. And all of those things are the focus of the ESG agenda, so actually businesses should be looking at those anyway. And we know from the different analyses over the years that companies with superior or strong ESG performance are going to perform better financially. There are so many ways that ESG creates value, and I think we've touched most of these already. The attraction of customers, if you've got a strong ESG proposition, certainly positioning yourself well with your competitors, and access to resources, great, whether it be community, government relations, finance. Energy, we're all looking at energy at the moment. Cost reduction is going to be a key piece there, a focus around sort of the environmental piece, low energy consumption, water intake, simply reducing the cost of your waste process is all going to be relevant in these tough times. And one of the points which has come up a couple of times, which Carol mentioned around employee retention, such an obvious and important one. Boosting employee motivation about the way you're doing business, how you're looking after employees, how you're generating that loyalty, retaining key talent. Carol mentioned that I think, and yourself, Matthew, that unemployment's not expected to rise. Therefore, it's going to be as important to make sure that you are bringing your employees along for the journey with you. And obviously, financially, better allocation of capital, taking that longer term view is going to make you much more attractive to finance providers, equity investors who are looking for businesses behaving in the right way to meet their own criteria. And I think I would say also, in terms of keeping it on the boardroom agenda, look at the flip side. ESG certainly can be value enhancing, and people might have specific views on how that's delivered and measured. But I don't think anybody would argue with the idea that getting ESG wrong is value destructive. Missteps in it, whether it's advertising, whether it's in your supply chain, whether it's misinformation, greenwashing, woke washing, can have a huge impact on business. And those are the sort of things which are critical and value destructive at any time. And I think as we go through this next few months, years, it's going to be even more destructive. It could be the final straw. So, certainly keep your eye on that.
And Hannah, ultimately, at the end of any economic chain, there's a consumer who makes a buying choice. And brands, obviously, their main purpose is to set out to the consumer the values, the quality, all the rest of it, of the products that they're promoting. Do you think consumers, as their own budgets are squeezed, as you describe, are really going to look beyond pure price when it comes to the things that they buy out of a budget which in real terms is shrinking quite sharply?
It's a good question. I think, again, not a surprise that in terms of disposable income, consumer confidence, it's something very much high on the agenda. But I think That's the immediate picture that businesses are clearly grappling with. But I think there's also an element here about thinking about this long-term direction of travel, this long-term opportunity that business have through their ESG strategy and delivery of it. And of course, businesses at the moment, particularly those that are consumer facing, those that are brands, have got a great opportunity at the moment to start their differentiation journey against their competitors. Particularly those who've perhaps gone out there with promises or undertakings or commitments, which are going to be relevant to consumer brand loyalty during this difficult time. I think your brand, as we've said, is going to be very quickly damaged if you move away from that, because I don't think any of us can dispute, and there have been lots of surveys, certainly in recent months, showing consumer worries, what's on the consumer worry list, and climate change, for example, has fallen behind cost of living crisis, income levels, security in the sort of consumer and public concerns, but it's still up there. It's still, it's still one of the very top concerns. And I think the other thing to remember, of course, is that when it comes to dealing with other businesses, so in the B2B, where there may be a consumer at the end of the chain, those businesses similarly cannot step away from this agenda, because they're under their own pressures to meet their own investor requirements, their own finance requirements, and satisfy their own consumers in terms of the journey that they're on. So in order to have those business partners, you need to be on the journey with them and have your own targets to help them meet theirs. So it's not simply a case of being able to pop ESG into a drawer and wait till the better times come, because I think it's so integral at the moment to the way we're doing business, as well as to consumer satisfaction and being up there on the sort of consumer preference. And you mentioned transparency earlier on. Consumers do want to know what the companies that they're dealing with and they're buying from, where they are in terms of their ESG activities and performance. And pricing might be at the top of their worry list at the moment, but the large proportion of consumers, and there's research that shows this, still expect more in terms of brand and retailer performance, ESG performance, than they did pre-pandemic. And there is a general expectation from the public and consumers that sustainable behaviours are going to continue to increase, notwithstanding the cost of living crisis. And I think that's something that all businesses should remember. So I think it's that differentiation and that seeing this as a longer term play, which means actually your consumers are going to be interested. It might not be what's instantly influencing them at that moment in time, but in terms of consumer loyalty, it's going to be very, very relevant.
And I mean, Hannah, you talk to boards of lots of different kinds of companies. What sorts of conversations are you having with them in order to help them in this sort of journey that you're describing, keep their ESG strategy in the forefront of mind as they're fighting the kinds of fires that Carol and Charlotte were talking about earlier?
Yeah. Well, the boardroom's certainly a very busy and sort of a high tension place, as you would expect. And I think one of the things that Carol and Charlotte had on their top 3 list was governance. And, governance is always up there. It should always be up there. But I think, the discussions we're having really is about seeing governance as the broader good order of business, not just looking at the financial, as we might purely think of governance or might historically have thought of it. It needs to look from a governance point of view at risk. We talked again, Charlotte mentioned about the scenario planning. What does a rainy day look like in the current crisis? And I think a lot of the conversations that we're having really are looking at ESG as part of that scenario planning, recognizing that actually that scenario might not just be for the rainy day that's coming next week, but for much longer future periods. But that's relevant now, because if you're looking for finance, if you're looking for investment, if you're looking to improve B2B relationships, the way you're approaching the longer term period is going to be relevant to a lot of those decision making processes. I mean, in the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen such a vast move and a vast change to the ESG atmosphere, the ESG sphere. It's regulation, reporting, metrics, culture. And I think businesses really need to be looking in their scenario planning about what what the coming years are going to bring, and are they going to be ready for it? Because hopefully if they're sort of approaching the right way with a longer term view whilst dealing with those immediate pressures that we've just been hearing about, they've got a much better future. And it goes back to that point about the opportunity that a situation like this brings, as well as the sort of the crisis. One of the other areas we're talking about with businesses is how they monitor, measure and report on their own individual metrics, going back to that point around transparency, because that's going to be crucial as well going forward, keeping that sort of loyalty, making sure that your business partners and your finance providers and your investors all see the way that you're approaching this. And ultimately, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, you can't talk a good story, you can't explain to everybody you're doing business with how you're getting on. And this is about looking at risk as well, looking at internally, looking at the risk through the external engagement that you've got, whether it's with your supply chain, and again, providing them the information that they want. And of course, one of the most recent changes we've seen, and the biggest wave of change, is around the regulation being placed on finance providers and the general direction of travel in terms of what they are going to need to see, how they're going to justify their lending decisions. And you need to make sure that your business, and this is some of the conversations we're having, you want to make sure your business is on top of the list of the businesses that those finance providers want to invest in or provide financial support to, because that is going to help you through that crisis. And getting on the top of that list is only going to be done if you are measuring and tracking the right metrics so that they're fulfilling their requirement to their investors. And there's a huge amount of conversation, as you might imagine, around the sort of metrics and the standardization in this space. And I suppose the third conversation, again, coming back to which have already been touched on by Charlotte and Carol, businesses want to support their employees. We've seen such a tight labour market, and all indications is that isn't going to change. It's going to be more important than ever, whilst people are feeling the pinch in their own pockets, to think about the talent that you're going to retain. This is about thinking about your business in the broadest term of sustainability, by which I mean, if you're going to be a sustainable business, it means you're going to be around in the future. You're going to continue having employment to offer to these people. You're going to continue having business partners with whom you do business, and you're going to continue contributing to your wider stakeholder group. So thinking of employees as, it's central to ESG, being the S in it, but it's actually central to a lot of the conversations that we're having at the moment.
And finally, and briefly, if you would, Hannah, what advice would you have? All boards, of course, are full of wonderful people who think deeply about all of these issues all of the time, but there may be some people listening to this webinar who are slightly struggling to get this high enough up the board agenda. What tips can you give them? What advice can you give them to help get the board to see why the sorts of considerations that you've been talking about matter particularly now?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sort of sure that there's always a voice somewhere, and I would say hopefully not around too many boardroom tables these days, but somewhere saying this is something, ESG is something that can wait this crisis out. We will get around to it. It's on the list for when times are better. I think the difference in having those conversations now to perhaps where we were 10 years ago is that the business landscape has changed. The issues that we're talking about in this session today, energy, cost of living, inflation, workforce, supply chains, they are ESG issues, and no business can approach this crisis properly without having those on its agenda, and essentially doing business in the right way, which is again what ESG is about. And I suppose, just very briefly, you cannot separate good boardroom decision making from all of those issues, and that doing business in the right way, no matter what your business is going through. So it isn't a separate topic to be put in a drawer and picked out when times are good. I mean, ultimately, disregarding any element of the ESG agenda now is quickly going to make your business an easy one for people to choose not to finance, not to do business with, not to invest in, not to work for. And I would say that, whilst we all hope the tough economic times will go away, ESG and everything that it encompasses is not going anywhere. So, it cannot be disregarded.
Thank you very much, Hannah. If any of you watching and listening has any questions, do please put them in the Q&A. We'd be very happy to pick them up. That's reached the end of what we wanted to talk about. Just maybe a question from me to Carol, if I may. What Hannah was describing there earlier about the need in the finance community to justify the way in which money is being invested has been a feature of the way in which European regulators certainly have looked at creating almost self-enforcing mechanisms to improve corporate standards. Do you see the same features in the US market? Is regulation of the financial sector as a lever into the general economy being used in the same way?
It's not as forceful as what we're seeing in Europe and the UK, but the beginnings of it are there. The SEC has been putting out proposed regulations pretty regularly for the last year. They're still under comment, but we're headed that way. We're just behind. I think it is going to be regulated. The issue that is being discussed in the US is how how the ESG compliance and the things related to lending are going to be accounted for and disclosed. And there has been a tremendous discussion, amount of pushback on measurement and disclosure. But yes, we are headed in that direction. We're just behind.
And perhaps a question for Charlotte and Hannah, because you've both in different ways talked about the importance of the quality of governance and the way in which a board functions. Charlotte, in tackling the sort of pressures that the economy will create on any board, and Hannah in looking at these broader important ESG issues. From what you see, have boards got the right people around the table? Are they supremely well equipped to deal with the numbers, but perhaps less well equipped to deal with some of these wider pressures? If you're heading a nominations committee, should you be looking at the spread of experience that you have available around the boardroom table?
I think, as ever, Matthew, the answer is it depends. So I think we probably within this firm see a vast array of different types of businesses, either on the same side of the table as us or on the other side of the table, and also a kind of real difference in how that governance is applied. So, you know, they'll range from the kind of very entrepreneurial startups through to the pretty heavyweight PLC. And if you're a heavyweight PLC, your shareholders will make sure that you have, well, will generally make sure that you have a pretty experienced board with a wide variety of talents and probably a ESG compliance officer in this day and age as well. Am I right in that, Hannah? I mean, I've seen it badged up as various things, but it's quite a wide brief that person normally has to undertake.
That's right, and I think it comes back to the point that Carol was talking about, having a committee. You know, so often there's a committee with that sort of ESG responsibility, particularly in sort of the larger PLCs. I suppose in terms, just my thoughts on board composition. I mean, again, the S of ESG, of course, brings in the diversity elements to make sure you've got the broad spectrum of sort of perspective when it comes to decision making. So, you know, I don't think that anybody disputes that all boards, regardless of financial crises or otherwise, are being looked at from that perspective. But one interesting thing that has come up and has come up with clients of mine in recent weeks in discussions is really particularly some of the more entrepreneurial and younger businesses that may not have that experience of having traded through times such as this. You know, somebody was making the point that if a CEO is sort of only been in a senior management role for maybe 15 years, they wouldn't necessarily have the experience or perhaps spot some of the warning signs that you know, Charlotte was listing earlier on, those third-party behaviours that can send up vital clues. So I think there's the sort of the board experience and sort of obviously, you know, as I would say, remaining connected with your advisors to sort of help them bring to the table those kind of tips.
Yeah, and a lot of the time it's about communication, isn't it? Communication and respect amongst the board. I mean, I think some of the healthiest board relationships I've seen are the ones where actually you do get directors challenging each other, but in a very sort of measured way. So actually, you know, everything gets out on the table and gets aired and discussed. And you don't have the lonely CFO crying over his computer and spreadsheet on their own, trying to work out what's going on. But actually, people pull together in a crisis in that way as well. And you know, that is a huge strength. And other stakeholders like the bankers will know it as well, and will be far more willing to back a functional and sort of sensible management team than they will be one where they're a bit concerned about how the communications between that management team are working.
In the US, having come recently from the National Association of Corporate Directors Conference, and I think in part response to the SEC's proposed regulations, we are seeing the ESG component being broken off of the audit committee because it's too much for the audit committee to handle in addition to all its other obligations. So we're beginning to see our large corporates create separate committees with separate set of professionals to deal with ESG compliance. And I think that that level of attention at our Fortune 100, 200 companies is gonna trickle down to everybody else. So while we are nowhere near as advanced as the EU and the UK, we are playing catch-up ball in a big hurry, and our directors are very focused on it in terms of making sure that they're ready for whatever compliance is actually required, but also trying to figure out how to do over and above what's necessary, because they recognize, just as all of us in the professional service industry recognize, that it's become incredibly important to their customers, and just like it's become very important to our clients.
Thank you very much for that. I think we've got time for one last quick question, which is alongside all these economic pressures and so forth that we've been talking about. We do have running at the moment in Sharm el-Sheikh an attempt actually to address and do something positive about the major long-term issue the planet faces in the shape of climate change. And I just wondered if I could ask each of you very quickly to say what you think business should be thinking about as we go through COP27. And I appreciate, Carol, I'm putting you in a very difficult position because until you know the outcome of the US midterm elections, it may not be 100% certain what the direction of the US is. But let's let Hannah and Charlotte start with that and finish with you, Carol.
I think.
Yeah, go for it, Hannah.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think, you know, from my perspective, we wait to see the sort of the full output from COP27 and the Squire Patton Boggs ESG managers there as we speak and reporting back and sort of on his activities. So interested to hear how that goes. But I think it's a couple of things that probably I've already touched on, which is this isn't going anywhere, and that, you know, COP27 will have done, you know, many things, but I'm sure one of them will have been to continually raise the profile of this agenda for everybody, all consumers. And I think that sort of long-term view is one which is going to come through. I think, you know, we're all very alive to the fact that what was sort of, you know, 2030 seemed like a lifetime away, and all of a sudden we sit here on the cusp of 2023, and long term is actually medium term, and I think that's going to make a lot of businesses reflect on where they are on their journeys.
Yeah, and I think despite being a restructuring lawyer, I'm a complete optimist, and I would like to think that out of all the sort of anguish of the Ukraine war and all the fluctuating energy prices, the importance of moving to more sustainable forms of energy production will come to the fore. And actually, once the economic case is there for it, which this environment is creating, that particular area of ESG, if you like, will actually benefit.
I think from the U.S. perspective, I think that the comment about what the midterm election is going to do or not do vis-a-vis the U.S. response, I think is a valid one. I think the underlying issue and some of the response to President Biden's speech are all about money, and it's all about budget, and it's all about how things are going to be allocated. And I think that's where we get to a toss up, because we don't know what our House or Senate are really going to look like. Although I think it's been a big surprise to a lot of people that we didn't end up with huge win by the Republicans. So I don't know. I don't have a read on what we're going to do with the budget, but the bottom line on climate change is it needs financing. And I mean, hard funds need to be invested in the changes. And I think the discussion in the U.S. at the federal level is that we're experiencing the impacts in this country, and we need to get much more serious and much more realistic about creating programs that are going to be able to cover off how we address it. Long way to go in the U.S.
Well, thank you. Warm thanks to Carol, to Charlotte, and to Hannah, and thank you all for joining today's webinar. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first in a series that we're running over the next few weeks. So do please join us for our future planned webinars. The next one is on December the 1st, and we'll be looking at global data, technology, and tax. And then through into January, on the 12th of January, we're going to look at global anti-counterfeiting and brand protection trends and advertising, media, and brands hot topics. And then on the 26th of January, we'll look at ESG and the rise of ESG, but particularly with the global workforce angle to it. And obviously workforce is one of the things that we have talked about in this webinar. We'll be digging into more detail on that. If any of those is of interest to you, then you're most welcome to sign in and join us for those. And we very much hope that you will do so. And with that, warm thanks to you all, and keep safe.